What's up, guys? I'm DK, and you're watching Pro Wrestling What If, the series where I look at the different what if scenarios as terms of the world that we call professional wrestling. What do you get when you mix the spooky season with the world of professional wrestling? You get the annual October premium live event of Halloween Havoc. Having begun in 1989 by World Championship Wrestling that would have weird match concepts like the Thunderdome and Chamber of Horrors matches. However, we did see some great matches happen during this event's original run until 2000 in WCW. Once WCW was bought out, it almost seemed as if we were never going to see Halloween Havoc as an event again. That would be until it made its return in 2020 as a part of the NXT brand and is still around today as this gets released. With events like this, we usually have an understanding of what the main event would be, but what if each of the events had different matches to close out the show? So with the 2025 installment of Halloween Havoc this weekend, we're discussing what if every Halloween Havoc main event was different. And if you haven't checked it out yet, we also have a series on the shorts portion of the channel discussing if the Halloween Havoc main event results were different. And if you end up enjoying this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share this to all your friends, subscribe, and press the notification bell for when future episodes get released, and leave a comment down below about today's topic or suggesting a future topic for an episode of Pro Wrestling What If. Kicking off with Halloween Havoc 1989, the main event was Ric Flair and Sting versus the Great Muta and Terry Funk in the Thunderdome match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Brian Pillman versus Lex Luger for the NWA United States Championship. Lex Luger had already been a prominent member of the WCW roster as he was a member of the Four Horsemen at one point, as well as having a reign as the NWA World Tag Team Champion. So I think Lex Luger and the NWA United States Championship could have been the main event had it not gone with the most logical match. Ric Flair and Sting were amongst two of the biggest stars in the company, so it was a bit difficult to figure out what else could have main evented, especially when their match involved Bruno Sammartino as the special guest referee and had a crazy concept involving an electrified steel cage. Also, shout out to Great Muta for putting out a fire from a pyro accident using his green mist. What a badass. With that match involving the world champion, it only seemed logical that the match involving the next top prize would be considered to be the main event instead. Halloween Havoc 1990, the main event was Sid Vicious versus Sting for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Stan Hansen versus Lex Luger for the NWA United States Championship. Lex Luger at this point was the United States Champion for over 500 days in his third reign, as he won it at a house show on May 22nd, 1989. There was a story built up between Hansen and Luger going into this due to their placement on the top 10 singles rankings of WCW. This match had Stan Hansen become victorious and end that 500-day plus reign, which would have been a shocking way to end the night off. Now, originally I was going to go with the tag team match involving Ric Flair and Arn Anderson against Doom for the tag team championships. However, it was around this time where Ric Flair wasn't around the main event scene as much as he was. This was all due to Executive Vice President Jim Herd trying to phase him out, feeling Flair was too old to be involved and contribute to the promotion in any way. It so happens that putting focus on younger talent is something Vince McMahon would end up doing a few years later with the World Wrestling Federation. Also, there wasn't a clear winner in that match, unlike the United States Championship match, so it might have been a bad idea to put that in the slot with the outcome that it had. Halloween Havoc 1991, the main event was Ron Simmons versus Lex Luger in a 2 out of 3 falls match for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Chamber of Horrors match. With the concept of this match, it already screamed that there was a likely chance that this could have been the main event of this pay-per-view, especially since the match was already being promoted a month before using a steel cage structure very similar to the Thunderdome match from the first Halloween Havoc that was the main event of that show. This time around with an extra steel cage that would go in the middle of the ring and had a chair to electrocute a competitor that would be put into it. The match also had some star power when you had the WCW United States Champion Sting as well as Big Van Vader involved. Speaking of Vader, he wasn't originally in the match as the team he was on was supposed to include Oz, the Diamond Stud, One Man Gang, and Barry Windham. Halloween Havoc 1991's pre-show would have Barry Windham being attacked by Arn Anderson and Larry Zbyszko and written off the show. The only one out of the original members of that team that would remain would be the Diamond Stud, who would later become Razor Ramon in the World Wrestling Federation. Although this match is regarded as one of the worst in company history, it might have been better off to end the night with this rather than actually kicking it off. Halloween Havoc 1992. The main event was Sting versus Jake Roberts in the Coal Miners Glove match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Barbarian versus Ron Simmons for the WCW WCW World Heavyweight Championship. Ron Simmons, months before this event, had won the WCW World Heavyweight Championship for the first time from Vader, making history by becoming the first African American to win the championship. One of his first defenses was against Cactus Jack, and it seemed the rivalry was going to continue until Jack had suffered a groin injury, thus beginning the storyline of Cactus Jack mentoring the Barbarian to go after the title. I can already see why this didn't end up main eventing the show due to the Barbarian not really being a believable threat. Most people already just see him as that tag team wrestler that came from the World Wrestling Federation. Halloween Havoc 1992 was the first to incorporate the spin the wheel, make a deal concept to the event, so it did make sense for that to have been the main event, especially when you have one of, if not the biggest babyface of the company, Sting, involved as one of the competitors, then having Jake Roberts as another competitor who is basically fresh off of leaving the World Wrestling Federation after his WrestleMania 8 match against The Undertaker. Halloween Havoc 1993. The main event was Cactus Jack versus Vader in a Texas death match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Ric Flair versus Rick Rude for the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship. After having a stint with the World Wrestling Federation for about a year and a half, Ric Flair would make his return to WCW in early 1993, especially that Jim Herd had left his position with WCW in January 1992 and that Bill Watts was in charge when signing Ric Flair back. Ric Flair was recognized as the first international champion when WCW withdrew from NWA on September 15th during his NWA World Heavyweight Championship reign that started at Beach Blast 1993. WCW owned the physical Big Gold Championship, but they weren't allowed to use the NWA name, thus renaming it the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship. The name would be made official when Rick Rude won the championship from Ric Flair at Fall Brawl 1993, that was days after WCW's withdrawal from NWA, thus having the match happen at Halloween Havoc, described by the WCW Control Center as a rematch unprecedented to happen the following pay-per-view. Even though that the match had ended in a disqualification, the star power alone between both Flair and Rude would make the most sense to be the main event. A match that actually had a championship on the line, unlike the actual WCW World Heavyweight Championship that Vader was holding when having the Texas Death Match. Halloween Havoc 1994. The main event was Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan in a steel cage match for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Guardian Angel versus Big Van Vader. It's hard to imagine a match to be the main event here that wasn't Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, arguably two of the biggest stars of the entire professional wrestling business that weren't able to lock horns prior to 1994, even when they were in the World Wrestling Federation, or at least on pay-per-view, I should say. Hulk Hogan had made his WCW in-ring debut months prior at Bash at the Beach 1994, where he had won the WCW World Heavyweight Championship from Ric Flair. Now, this match was essentially the rematch from Bash at the Beach, but it had more star power than it already had due to Mr. T being the special guest referee. The only match that made sense to replace that as the main event would have been the Guardian Angel against Vader, considering the two were already involved in the Triangle Elimination match with Sting at Fall Brawl the prior month, and Vader was already deemed #1 contender to Hogan's World Championship. Halloween Havoc 1995. The main event was The Giant versus Hulk Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Hulk Hogan versus The Giant in the Sumo Monster Truck match. Can we just skip this event altogether, because both of these matches were the drizzling. The feud between Hulk Hogan and The Giant had already been building up since The Giant's debut at Slamboree in May 1995. So if it wasn't going to be the actual match between the two, then I think it would have unfortunately been the Sumo Monster Truck match to have been the main event instead. Part of the card may have ended up having to be switched up since Lex Luger turned heel during that main event match, and it wouldn't have made sense to have his match with Randy Savage to be the semi-main event with what occurred in it. The only upside this possibly has is to have a little bit of a better reasoning with stripping The Giant of the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, as now the show ends with him falling off the building. Even then, I'm cringing over that as I'm pressing the keys on my keyboard as I type this down. So let's just move on to 1996 already. Halloween Havoc 1996. The main event was Randy Savage versus Hollywood Hulk Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Outsiders versus Harlem Heat for the WCW World Tag Team Championship. Championships. Normally, I don't think unless it involved main eventers that the World Tag Team Championships would have been booked to be put on last. However, it was only a couple months prior at Bash at the Beach where we saw the famous heel turn from Hulk Hogan that led to the formation of the New World Order. So if it wasn't Hollywood Hulk Hogan main eventing with the World Heavyweight Championship, then I think the Outsiders would main event challenging for the World Tag Team Championships. The New World Order was now the biggest storyline of not only WCW, but all of professional wrestling, so they had to be in the main event in some way, shape, or form. Especially since Scott Hall and Kevin Nash did win the championships from Harlem Heat that night, so it calls for a big celebration to end off this event for the NWO. We would still be able to have the WCW debut of Roddy Piper happen after the main event, since Hollywood Hulk Hogan would be in the ring with the Outsiders. Shout out goes to Jackson Weingart, Jada Sanchez, Fox Starkiller, Lola Pines, Hayden Saravo, Skulchin, The Real Samuel Randall 1990, Quiet Ninja Riot, Wesley Conklin, and Adam Heb 01. And the reason that they ended up getting a shout out is because they joined our YouTube channel membership, which only cost $1.99 a month. Not only do you get the shout out, but you do get lots of other perks, including early access to every single video and shorts that we produce on this channel. So definitely consider joining our YouTube channel membership. It will be greatly appreciated and will go a long way of helping out this channel a lot. So definitely consider it, but let's get right back to the video. Halloween Havoc 1997. The main event was Roddy Piper versus Hulk Hogan in a non-title steel cage match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the Las Vegas sudden death match between Diamond Dallas Page and Randy Savage. I know what you guys are exactly thinking, as you're probably wondering why I didn't go with Rey Mysterio versus Eddie Guerrero for the Cruiserweight Championship. This is a perfect time to explain that when doing these types of what-if videos based off of pay-per-view main events, it's always the thought process going into the event and not how it turned out. Yes, I'm sure everybody knew this was going to be a great match, but I don't think anyone knew we were about to witness what arguably is the greatest match in the history of WCW before our very eyes. Eric Bischoff would have never put the Cruiserweights on as the final match, but this type of match, if anything, should have kicked off the event instead of being match 3. Diamond Dallas Page was on the rise of becoming one of the biggest baby faces of WCW, with the angle of him teasing to join the NWO before hitting Scott Hall with the diamond cutter that blew the roof off the place. Randy Savage was not only a top star of the company, but unlike the prior Halloween Havoc, he was now a member of the NWO. DDP and Randy Savage would have a rivalry throughout the year, with a no disqualification match at Spring Stampede and a Falls Count Anywhere match at the Great American Bash with 1 win apiece. We had the final match take place here at Halloween Havoc, and it would have made sense to go on last since the 2 previous matches were the main events of those respective pay-per-views. Halloween Havoc 1998. The main event was Diamond Dallas Page versus Goldberg for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been The Warrior versus Hollywood Hulk Hogan. Just like I had mentioned with Halloween Havoc 1995, can we just skip this one already and move on to the next event? We go from having the greatest WCW match the prior year at Halloween Havoc to what most people consider the worst of all time with this specific match. If it wasn't the WCW World Heavyweight Championship that was the main event, then it would have clearly been the match with the most amount of star power between 2 mainstays of the World Wrestling Federation in the 1980s and the early 1990s. Of course, the idea of this match was to capitalize on a rematch from their WrestleMania 6 bout back in 1990 for the World Wrestling Federation. However, we all knew that both Warrior and Hogan were well past their prime and couldn't live up to that expectation, but there is a positive to this. In the real timeline, when Goldberg and DDP main evented, not everyone got to see the entire match, as the event went overtime and cable providers ended the broadcast in the middle of the match, thus not only having to offer refunds for those viewing it live, but the match would be shown off for free in its entirety the following night on Nitro. Had Warrior and Hogan been the main event, I don't think too many people would have complained about missing half of the match, since it was hot garbage anyways. People were more invested in seeing if DDP could end Goldberg's undefeated streak in a match that many people regard as Goldberg's best match of his entire professional wrestling career. Halloween Havoc 1999. The main event was Goldberg versus Sting in a champion versus champion match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Hulk Hogan versus Sting for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. The only reason reason that Goldberg versus Sting even happened in the first place was because of the shenanigans involved with Sting versus Hulk Hogan. This match had already been heavily promoted due to their match the prior month at Fall Brawl, where Sting had won the championship from Hulk Hogan. However, one of the problems involving this time in WCW was Hulk Hogan's creative control clause in his contract that dictated how the ending of his matches can go. Another problem would be that it's around this time that Vince Russo had started running creative and Eric Bischoff was no longer in the company. So for the main event to have been different here would have involved Sting and Hogan's match to be the main event, and Sting versus Goldberg wouldn't exist. It would have been a terrible main event, of course, because it was only 3 seconds long, but it wouldn't have a sour taste in fans' mouths throughout the rest of the event, since now this goes on last. Halloween Havoc 2000. The main event was Goldberg versus Chronic in a handicap elimination match, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Scott Steiner versus Booker T for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. At last, the final Halloween Havoc under the WCW umbrella before they would be bought out by Vince McMahon in March of 2001. At this point, under Vince Russo's regime, Booker T was heavily booked as the top guy of the company, especially with how Bash at the Beach turned out. Scott Steiner was on a big singles run even before Russo was in charge, when he turned his back on his brother Rick and joined the NWO in 1998. I can see why WCW ended up going with Goldberg versus Chronic to be the main event, since Booker T and Scott Steiner's match would end in a disqualification. Plus, having the event on a bit of a happy note, unlike the last couple of Halloween Havocs, knowing Goldberg's career was continuing. However, I do think even going into the event that the quality of the World Heavyweight Championship match would have been much better than the handicap match, even with a bit of its overbooked mess with the amount of referee bumps involved. Halloween Havoc 2020. The main event was Candice LeRae against Io Shirai in a tables, ladders, and scares match for the NXT Women's Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Johnny Gargano versus Damian Priest in the Devil's Playground match for the NXT North American Championship. After a 20-year hiatus, Halloween Havoc would make its return as a television special for WWE's developmental territory NXT. This event also marked the return of the spin the wheel, make a deal concept that hadn't been used in WCW since the 1993 event with Cactus Jack versus Vader. This concept would be the exact reason for knowing what would be the main event here, since both match stipulations were determined by the wheel. Johnny Gargano would end up winning the NXT North American Championship from Damian Priest, so a new champion crown would have made sense to close the show. Halloween Havoc 2021. The main event was Braun Breaker versus Tommaso Ciampa for the NXT Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Mandy Rose versus Raquel Gonzalez in a trick or street fight for the NXT Women's Championship. Once again, a match with the stipulation determined by the spin the wheel, make a deal concept makes sense to be the main event of this rendition of Halloween Havoc. It's a little bit surprising that the NXT Championship that was the main event didn't have a stipulation at all, while the NXT Women's Championship, Tag Team Championships, and Women's Tag Team Championship matches did. With Mandy Rose having previously been a member of the main roster of WWE, it would give her an advantage to being placed in that main event spot. The event kicked off with the Scareway to Hell ladder match for the NXT Women's Tag Team Championships that saw Gigi Dolan and JC Jane of Toxic Attraction win the championships. The faction led by Mandy Rose herself, so having the entire group celebrate as they now all hold championship gold could have been a way to end off the night had it not been the NXT Championship match. Halloween Havoc 2022. The main event was Ilya Dragunov, JD McDonough, and Braun Breaker in a triple threat match for the NXT Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been the ladder match for the vacant NXT North American Championship with Carmelo Hayes, Nathan Frazier, Oro Mensah, Von Wagner, and Wes Lee. This specific event was actually the first under the NXT umbrella to be a premium live event instead of a television special like it was for 2020 and 2021. Although I had mentioned that it would make sense to have the spin the wheel, make the deal main event of Halloween Havoc, it didn't seem likely with the competitors involved with those matches for this event. This ladder match was the opening match of this event in the real timeline, but with this match determining a guaranteed new champion would have also made sense to close the show as well, especially with it being Wes Lee winning and fans hoping for a singles push for him after his partner was forced out of the company. Halloween Havoc 2023. Now this specific event had returned as a television special due to it being a 2-night event taking place across 2 weeks. So for night 1, the main event was Lyra Valkyria versus Becky Lynch for the NXT Women's Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Chase University versus The Family for the NXT Championships. And for night 2, the main event was Carmelo Raquel Hayes versus Ilya Dragunov for the NXT Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Nathan Frazier versus Dirty Dominic Mysterio for the NXT North American Championship. One of my reasonings for those matches to be put in those spots are due to them being for championships. For both nights of Halloween Havoc 2023, there were a total of 5 championship matches, with 2 being on night 1 and 3 being on night 2, with Dirty Dominic Mysterio being one of the most over heels of the entire WWE roster. It made sense for that North American Championship match to have been the night 2 main event if it wasn't the NXT Championship match. This would also make sense since Dom was a main roster member, just like Becky Lynch, who had main evented night 1. And last but not least, Halloween Havoc 2024. The main event was Ethan Page versus Trick Williams in the Devil's Playground match for the NXT Championship, but had it not been that match, I think it would have been Tony D'Angelo versus Obafemi in the Tables, Ladders, and Scares match for the NXT North American Championship. Now, I did briefly discuss this in our What If Every 2024 PLE main event was different video at the end of last year. So if you haven't seen that video, I guess now you'll hear what I probably had to say, or what I think I said, since my memory is dog from being a professional wrestler myself. Obafemi was on the rise of being one of the top stars of NXT by winning the Breakout Tournament and holding the NXT North American Championship until dropping it to Tony D'Angelo a few weeks prior to this event. This would be the culmination of this rivalry that would allow Femi to move on and challenge for the NXT Championship a few months later. Just like the NXT Championship match, this match had its stipulation determined by the spin the wheel, make a deal concept. So once again, that's another reason for that to have been the main event of Halloween Havoc.